Welcome to Pinnacle of Awesome, Buddhism Basics. I'm your host, Pema Shamsetso, and I'm here to help you understand the fundamentals of Buddhism. So whether you're a new Buddhist, a longtime practitioner, or just someone interested in being happier, this podcast is for you. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the paths to wisdom, learning, contemplation, and meditation. These aren't inherently Buddhist ideas, but you'll find yourself doing them in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to tell you what it means to learn, contemplate, and meditate, as well as how to most effectively use these tools to increase your understanding, experience, and ultimately realization of Buddhism, the path of happiness. So last week we talked about learning. Learning is getting information from the outside and taking it in. The essential quality of learning is the got it. And learning Dharma leads to understanding Dharma. So with that knowledge, let's jump into contemplation. Contemplation is taking what we've learned, our understanding, and looking at it. Contemplation is where we really examine the understanding, we ask questions about it, and we clarify doubts or realize our obstacles and try to overcome them. Contemplation is a very important step, and it's also a very vulnerable one. In contemplation, we really dig into what we believe, what we really believe. It's in this stage of contemplation that you check for truth. You take your understanding and you make judgment calls after a lot of testing. Buddhism is a science. We don't expect you to take everything that we are teaching and assume that it's truth. You have to test this for yourself. Contemplation is where you really deepen faith. In a later course, I'll go into the different types of faith, but there is a difference between blind faith and trusting faith. When you have trusting faith, it's a lot more secure. It's less easily shaken. And that's the kind of faith that's generated through contemplation and meditation. In this phase, it's important to be very honest with yourself. Acknowledging what we really believe can be very difficult for a number of reasons. One of them is that we don't like what we believe. A commonly held belief is the belief that I am powerless. And I don't really want to believe it, but I find myself believing it anyway. I don't want to believe this because that means that I have no control over my happiness or my suffering. It means that I can't help when other people are suffering. I don't really want to believe this, but I believe it anyway. And that disconnect can make it difficult to actually acknowledge that I believe that. One of the other obstacles to acknowledging what we truly believe is that we're embarrassed by what we believe. Negative thinking is stupid. The logic is faulty. There's little to no basis for it, and it's embarrassing. Once we really get into the logic of negative thinking, because the logic is so shoddy, it can be embarrassing to even admit that we believe that we have followed that logic. Take road rage, for example. It's super common. I still have the habit of doing it. I'll follow the logic of it. So I'm in my car, and someone cuts me off, and my initial reaction is anger. This stupid jerk cut in front of me. Doesn't he know I have places to be? Doesn't he know that I'm on my way to work? Why am I angry? Well, I'm angry because this person got into a space in front of me, and now this person is ahead of me. And somehow, by being ahead of me, this person has prevented me from getting to a place that I want to be. They haven't actually prevented me from getting to a place I want to be, and I have no evidence of that. In fact, they've probably only delayed it by a couple of seconds. And yet, I still get very angry at this person. The basis of that thinking is that my time is more important than this person's time. I have no consideration for where this person needs to be. And acknowledging things like that can be a little embarrassing. When enlightened beings achieve nirvana, there can be this little embarrassment when they look back at being a sentient being, of saying, gosh, what was I thinking? I have that in my daily life too, when I look back to even just 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, last week, 10 minutes ago. Sometimes I think, wow, what was I thinking? It's important to meet that obstacle and really understand it, to get over that and really decide, why do I believe this? And do I want to keep believing this? What we contemplate is our understanding. So we take the understanding that we acquired from learning, and we ask ourselves, is this always true? How does this affect my actions? Is this a good result? Does it benefit me? Does it benefit all beings? What kind of person would I be if I believed this? Do I like that person? Contemplation is where you discover your doubts and your obstacles. This is the part where you really dig into your understanding and figure out where it relates to your world. When testing Buddhism, and really anything, you have to give it time. One of the reasons why I have placed 2 weeks between most of these courses is to give you time to test these things. I give you homework as a little guidance of these are some of the ways that you can test it, because contemplation is a skill. Contemplation is a skill that you have to develop. The way that you find what you really believe is different for everyone. The way that you shake yourself out of your stupor is different for everyone. So the homework I'm giving you is not guidelines, but this is how you could do it. As you continue along this path and continue to contemplate more, you will find what works best for you. When contemplating, you need to acquire multiple data points. Think of it like learning how to play an instrument. We'll say the trumpet. The first time you play a trumpet, you sound awful. The second time you play a trumpet, you sound like a cat in heat. And even the third time you play a trumpet, you sound like a child blowing into a pool noodle. If you stop at that third attempt, you'll throw away the trumpet and say, this is garbage. This trumpet doesn't work. I've played it 3 times and I still sound awful. You haven't given enough time to determine whether or not that is in fact a bad trumpet, or if you're just bad at playing the trumpet. When you contemplate these Buddhist principles, it's really important to give yourself plenty of data points. We are as inexperienced at holding the principles of Buddhism as we are anything we have not trained for. That's why I want you to hold these principles for a couple of weeks. Be aware of them. Try putting them into practice. You're not going to be able to put them into practice immediately. You've spent a lot of time in this lifetime developing other skills. I have spent a lot of time in this lifetime developing my road rage. It makes sense that I'm not going to be able to change those habits in 3 attempts. The key to testing and contemplation is giving ourselves enough time to determine whether or not these tools will generate the causes of happiness. Going back to the trumpet metaphor, before deciding whether or not we want to continue learning how to play the trumpet, we need to figure out if we can play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, not necessarily if we can play the trumpet like Miles Davis. Obviously, the goal is to play the trumpet like Miles Davis, but until then, we use contemplation to see if there is a change. To clarify this metaphor, the trumpet is Buddhism and the practices of Buddhism, and the songs are the causes of happiness. So the better the song, the higher quality of happiness it produces. So Twinkle Twinkle Little Star will produce some happiness. But a Miles Davis tune will produce a much higher quality of happiness. In order to determine whether or not we can achieve greater happiness by practicing Buddhism, we have to determine whether or not we acquire even just a little bit of happiness while putting these practices into effect. When you contemplate and you ask yourself, are these principles always true? When I hold these principles, am I a better person? What kind of person would I be if I truly believed this? Is there truth to this? Do I see examples of this in my experience? When you ask yourself these questions, you will either experience some doubt or you will produce an experience. Contemplation is where you find doubts. It's where you clarify your doubts. So let's take last lesson's homework, for example. I asked you to, before a teaching, generate some desire for it. So take a couple minutes beforehand and really generate this desire of wanting this teaching. And let's say you've done this a couple of times. You've wanted to learn how to knit. And so before you've sat down to watch a YouTube video on knitting, you've taken a minute and said, I really want to learn knitting. And you've generated that. But you didn't really notice much of a difference. So that's when you take that and go back to learning. I didn't really notice a difference here. Why didn't I notice a difference? Was it because this isn't true? And you can have a skillful teacher walk you through it and say, well, what exactly were you repeating? And let's say you say something like, well, you told me to do this, so I did it. And so then I ask you, well, when you were thinking about this, were you thinking about how much you wanted to learn knitting? Or were you thinking about how I told you to do this? Were you repeating the desire to learn knitting? Or were you repeating the homework I gave you? Were you just thinking, I'm going to watch this YouTube video because Pema Shamsitso told me to. I'm going to watch this YouTube video because she told me to think a little bit before this video. And then you watch it and you don't notice a difference because what you were doing was not actually what I asked you to do. And so you clarify those doubts. Or you can come up with a specific question, like, you said that learning Dharma leads to understanding Dharma. But what exactly do you mean by understanding? What exactly does that term mean? So those kind of doubts and those kind of obstacles, you can either solidify them or you can overcome them. If we use the example of understanding, you say, I don't really know what you mean by understanding. You can go back in your notes or you can listen to the teaching again. And if you listen to the teaching, you'll hear me say, it's important to have both the words and meaning according to Buddhism. You'll also hear me talk about what understanding is not. You take those pieces and you try to figure out if the meaning of understanding is present in those pieces that I have taught. If you have a doubt or a question that you cannot resolve yourself, or that cannot be resolved by talking to other people who have listened to the course, then you can email me at pinnacleofawesome@gmail.com. Contemplating Dharma leads to experiencing Dharma. When you contemplate, you will run up against your doubts and obstacles. You will either overcome those or you won't. If you can't overcome them, then you clarify them and you go back to the learning phase and you make sure that you get an answer to your question according to Buddhism, according to the teachings of Buddha, and then you come back to contemplation. If you overcome them, you will have an experience. Experiences are the aha moments. They're the oh moments. If we go back to the metaphor of the trumpet and learning how to play the trumpet, We understand learning as the process of learning how to play the trumpet. We go see a teacher, the teacher tells us how to hold the trumpet. We look at the music and we figure out the notes we need to play in order to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. We figure out where to put our fingers and we test it out. We're in the contemplation phase now, where we're kind of dinking around with it and we're blowing into it in different ways. We've sounded like a child blowing into a pool noodle. Maybe we've even gotten to the point where we sound like someone sitting on a whoopee cushion. At some point in time after the practice, we finally hit one of the notes that we have been trying to hit. That moment is an experience. That is what we need to take and repeat and meditate on. Just because you have the experience of reaching that note doesn't mean that you will always be able to immediately get to that note. It just means that you have a reference point. It helps you figure out where you need to go, where you need to be. It gives you the experience of what you are aiming for. And that experience is what we take into meditation. In the last course, I asked you to get a little notebook to carry with you. Use this notebook in the contemplation as well. Have one side be questions, and the other side be experiences. Because these experiences are things that you're going to want to repeat. I understand that we are busy people. You might have an experience right before you need to go do something else. By having this little book around, you can write down your experience and repeat it later on. By writing down the experiences after you have them, it helps remind you of the experience itself, which is crucial when we are trying to repeat those experiences and repeat the feeling of those experiences. Contemplation has a couple of different methods that should all be utilized. One of the methods is a very formal contemplation tun or contemplation session. In this, get your notes, pee, get water, get your notebook, the audio cast, whatever you need. Tell people that you're going to be unavailable for a little bit and sit down and genuinely think about whatever it is that you're contemplating. Take 45 minutes to 2 hours and chew on what we're talking about. You can have a notebook and write it down. You can talk. However you process, however you work through these things, use that to contemplate. I'm a talker. For me, I get my experiences through talking things out. When I go into these contemplation sessions, I let people know that I'm going to be unavailable for 45 minutes. I'd put my phone on airplane mode and I just sit. I have water. I have my notes. I have a pen and paper. I have my contemplation notebook and I just start talking. I follow logic trails. I talk about my experiences. I try to make connections. This kind of contemplation session is really good. The commitment to staying in that place and really dedicating that time to introspection really deepens the quality of the investigation. Another method of contemplation is, at the beginning of the day, pick a principle. Pick one aspect of Buddha's teachings and try to hold it throughout the day. Look for examples during the day. Really observe not only your surroundings, but your thinking. Let's take learning as an example. At the beginning of the day, set your intention. Say, today I am going to look for all the ways that I learn. I'm going to be aware of the instances where I take outside information in and learn. And throughout the day, you remind yourself, oh, I'm looking for this. Or, oh, here, I had no idea that I was learning in this instance. I was talking to a barista and all of a sudden I realized that I'm learning about coffee. Okay, interesting. And hold that principle throughout the day and observe, because when you go to do a practice session and you ask yourself, where do I see this in my daily life? This practice of observation is going to give you a lot of those data points. Another method is testing. I gave you a way to test some of the principles that I had addressed in learning last week. I asked you to tally all the times in which you found your mind wandering during an instance in which you were learning. And then I asked you to, before sitting down to do some form of learning, to spend a couple of minutes really generating that desire to learn, and then tally how often you're distracted in those, and comparing and contrasting. So the act of performing those tests is a form of contemplation. It allows you to acquire data points while also controlling some of the variables in the situation. I have given you hypotheses. Buddhism does not ask you to believe these things without testing them. In fact, it is highly encouraged to test them. One of the most important practices of contemplation is evaluating the data after a bit of time. Really look at what you've observed, the results of your tests, and really look at the general trends in your thinking, how it's changed. Because ultimately, this is all about your thinking. It's about your happiness. It's about decreasing your suffering, decreasing your negative thinking. Ask yourself, am I more aware of my thinking? Am I able to identify the ways in which I learn? Am I able to perform these experiments? Taking note of your progress on this path is very key, because the evaluation of your contemplation is itself a data point, especially when we sit down to decide, do I believe this? What kind of person would I be if I held this principle? By performing those tests, by holding those principles, by doing those experiments, and then looking at the results of those experiments, you can take that into your contemplation and use that to either clarify or overcome doubts. So your homework for this session is to get a contemplation book if you don't already have one. You can use the backside of a questions book and practice looking inward. I'm going to give you a hypothesis proposed by Buddha. Anger is suffering. I want you to examine that statement over the next couple of weeks. When you're angry or frustrated, find your feet and let that anger or frustration rest. Be aware of where your feet are. Follow the inhale and exhale of your breath. Just don't feed that anger. And then look, does your anger subside after a couple minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Examine the object of your anger. Why are you angry? I'll give you an example. For those of us who drive, very commonly we experience road rage. When someone cuts in front of me, my initial first reaction is anger. When someone cuts in front of me, I feel that anger. And I recognize it. I recognize that feeling. So I stop. I take a deep breath in. I find my feet. And I look at it. Why am I really angry when someone cuts me off? What is it about that action that generates my suffering? I think to myself, this person is a jerk. Well, what about that action makes them a jerk? Well, they're not considering where I have to be. And then I follow the logic of that. So, does that mean that they should have gotten in behind me? But if they get in behind me, does that mean that they're not considering the time of the person who's behind me? Do they have to wait until there are no cars to get in front of in order to be a considerate driver? Am I asking this person to consider my time while not considering their time? Does this act actually create suffering? Does it create suffering for everyone? Does it always create suffering? These are a couple of things you can ask yourself. And I want you to focus on that sentence for the next couple of weeks. Anger is suffering. Apply the tools of contemplation that I have given you in this course to that statement. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email me, pinnacleofawesome@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Pinnacle of Awesome, Buddhism Basics. This concludes the second teaching in this course on learning contemplation and meditation. Now that you are armed with an understanding of contemplation and methods to contemplate with, I hope that you take time to investigate the teachings of Buddha as well as your own beliefs. Be fearless in your introspection. I look forward to clarifying your doubts and listening to your experiences. The next teaching is on meditation, the final piece in our learning contemplation and meditation path to wisdom. If you have any questions or want to just share your experiences, you can email me at pinnacleofawesome@gmail.com. May these teachings benefit you as much as they have benefited me. May we use these teachings to decrease our anger, jealousy, greed, pride, and ignorance. May we use these teachings to increase our renunciation, compassion, faith, love, and wisdom. May we be better people tomorrow than we are today.